Any good student of history will tell you that truth is often stranger than fiction. People pay money to go see scary movies, to experience that thrill when the murderer jumps out of the woods wielding an axe. But when the movie's over, we comfort ourselves, saying that things like that don't really happen. But in one small southern Illinois town in 1874, an axe-wielding horror came out of the darkness, terrified the town, and just as quickly disappeared back into the darkness, just like out of a movie. The Saxtown Axe Murders of 1874 are barely remembered today, but in their day they made headlines throughout the nation. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The small southern Illinois town of Saxtown was a farming community where people primarily spoke German. Its residents were immigrants from Germany, fleeing the Napoleonic Wars, famine, or other hardships. In the U.S., they could own and farm their own land, a privilege that many were denied in the Old World. The farmers lived in wooden cottages, separated from each other by miles in some cases. Life in the community was primitive. There was no police department, no library, no bank. Farmers kept what cash or valuables they had in their homes until they could make a trip to the bank to deposit them. The closest town with these types of amenities was Belleville, the St. Clair County seat, almost 9 miles north of Saxtown. The community was largely closed to outsiders and private. But within the community, everyone knew everybody else's business. For example, according to author Nicholas Pister, Carl Stillson-Reid, the patriarch of the Stillson-Reid family, was a known alcoholic. On his dark days, Saxtown residents could find Carl wandering the muddy roads, muttering to himself in German about events long past. Stillson-Reid had immigrated with his wife, Maria, from Hille, Germany, in the 1840s, after his house was destroyed twice, first by an unknown arsonist and second by an errant lightning strike. They had lost 3 children to disease in Germany, and only one child, a boy named Fritz, lived to adulthood. Carl and Maria must have hoped their luck would turn around in the New World. After a 2-month trip across the Atlantic, their ship sailed up the Mississippi River from New Orleans and stopped at St. Louis, Missouri. It was a booming city on the river, suffering from clouds of coal dust and occasional outbreaks of disease, mainly caused by drinking contaminated river water. Mark Twain, the American author, described St. Louis as a filthy place. The coal smoke used to bank itself in a dense, billowy black canopy over the town and hide the sky from view. His opinion of the people dwelling there wasn't much better. Twain wrote, "If you send a damn fool to St. Louis, and you don't tell him he's a damn fool, they'll never find out." After seeing the dirt, the filth, the treatment of slaves in St. Louis, the Stillson-Reids decided to cross the river and move instead to southern Illinois. They settled in Saxtown, a place mostly populated by other German immigrants. They planted wheat, corn, oats. They raised pigs as well as cattle, and like other residents of Saxtown, they mostly made their own clothes and their own tools. They had seemingly left the shadows of the old world behind. The family did so well that they began lending money to their neighbors, generating even more income on the interest. But not everyone took the loans, because Carl Stillson-Reid could be a quarrelsome lender. For example, he fought with his own brother over an inheritance, and the two remained estranged for the rest of their lives. Maria, Carl's wife, died in 1866, but she had nearly 20 peaceful years in the New World. The Stillson-Reid son, Fritz, married a local woman named Anna. In 1868, they had 2 children together. The younger couple took over management of the farm from the elder Carl, who continued to live with them and to drink. Anna's brother, Fred Bolts, took a handful of loans from Carl, but had trouble repaying them. Though the Bolts farm was close to the Stillson-Reids, the families were not close, because of the money and Carl's attitude. In March 1874, the roads in and out of Saxtown were nearly impassable from the spring rains, and a deep layer of muck prevented easy travel. At a farm auction at nearby High Prairie on Thursday, March 19th, Carl Stillson-Reid carried a willow basket, which, residents speculated, was filled with money, supposedly from a recent inheritance. He offered anyone at the auction up to $800 in loans, but no one bid. Ben Schneider, one of the Stillson-Reid's neighbors, however, bought some potato seedlings from Carl and was told to pick them up at the Stillson-Reids the following day. No one suspected that it was the last time Carl Stillson-Reid would be seen alive. The next day, around 5 p.m., Schneider went to pick up his purchase at the Stillson-Reids and was puzzled by the silence he discovered at the farm. The Stillson-Reid's new dog, Monk, was barking from inside the farmhouse, and the cows hadn't been milked. He called for Fritz, the younger Stillson-Reid, but no one came out of the house. When Schneider pushed open the farmhouse door, he beheld a grisly scene that reporters would later label as the biggest crime to happen in America since the murder of Abraham Lincoln. The 5 members of the Stillson-Reid family were dead. The bodies of Carl, Fritz, Anna, and their 2 children, a 3-year-old and an 8-month-old baby, lay in pools of blood. The members of the family had been killed by bludgeoning, by having their throats cut, or by a vicious attack with what appeared to have been an axe. 3 severed fingers lay in the middle of the floor. Carl Stillson-Reid had been struck so hard that his head was nearly severed from his neck. Anna was dead in bed with her 2 children, the baby laying on her chest. Schneider ran screaming for help. Carl Stillson-Reid's willow basket was found inside the house empty. No one knows if it ever really contained money. The nearby farmers came quickly as the news spread and guarded the gruesome scene until the sheriff could arrive from Belleville. They covered the family's corpses with sheets. The citizens of Saxtown knew the state of the roads in and out of town. Chillingly, they believed the killer was still among them. Neighbors suspected neighbors. George Schneider, the brother of Ben Schneider, the man who had stumbled on the scene, was so disturbed by the murders he fainted rather than entering the house. But George Schneider was a butcher, so the citizens were wondering why he was so affected by the gore. Had he been responsible for the killings? A few days before the murders, George Schneider had sold the Stillson-Reids their Newfoundland dog. The whispers increased. How had the killer managed to lock the guard dog in a back room, unless it had known that person? Another resident, George Killian, who was a miner by trade, entered the home and asked the sheet be taken off of Anna's corpse, saying, "Let me see how bad her head is hammered out of shape." The whisper started again. How had George Killian known what the body looked like? Cuts in the frame of one of the doors of the Stillson-Reid's house indicated that the axe had been wielded by a left-handed man. How many of the residents of Saxtown were left-handed? John Afkin, an itinerant farmhand who was particularly skilled with his axe at removing tree stumps from the ground, didn't bat an eye when his neighbors described the Stillson-Reid's bodies to him. Why was he so unperturbed, they whispered, when he had known the family well, working a few seasons with them? Afkin was strong enough to do the deed, and he cut stumps from the ground equally well with both his left and right hands. One of the many rumors about the murders that was not reported in the papers at the time, and so we have to question its veracity, is that Carl Stillson-Reid died with a hank of red hair in his hand, probably ripped off the head of the man who was attacking him. Afkin had bright red hair. There were boot prints in the yard and a trail of blood that led away from the home. The residents followed it and found bloody tobacco leaves along the trail. Throughout history, tobacco leaves have been used for pain relief and the healing of cuts. The killer must have injured himself, the residents declared. Clues were beginning to come together. They were looking for a left-handed man with maybe a wound. Like bloodhounds on the scent, they continued to follow the trail and discovered that the nearest farm to the bloody tobacco leaves was owned by Fred Bolts, the deceased woman's brother and one of the men who had fought with Carl Stillson-Reid over his loans. Sheriff James Hughes arrived and began an investigation, starting with the crime scene itself. According to later reports, Hughes came outside of the Stillson-Reid's home and said to the crowd, "I think it is the most revolting crime that I have ever seen or heard of." It would be the most high-profile case of his career. This was an era before the development of forensic science, before fingerprinting was used, before crime scene photography. All Hughes could base his case on were the clues he could find with his eyes or glean from the rumors swirling around the community. Newspaper reporters followed the sheriff into the small town. Newspaper headlines described the Illinois horror. A German newspaper printed in Belleville called it the Grauenhafter Mord, German for gruesome murder. Reporters were tasked with getting as much information as they could out of Saxtown as quickly as possible. The Stillson-Reid's name was misspelled or written phonetically in many of the publications. Communication was not only bogged down by the distance the small town was from St. Louis, but also by the fact that most of its citizens spoke only German. The reporters played fast and loose with the names and ages of the family. Speculation ran rampant. Was it one killer or two? What was the motive? Meanwhile, their readers waited breathlessly for the next development. Sheriff Hughes at first thought the deed was done by one killer, and it was a crime of passion rather than for money. He pointed to some cash left in the house as proof of his reasoning. Hughes interviewed Fred Bolts, who, along with Carl Stillson-Reid's estranged brother, stood to inherit from the dead family. Hughes looked for injuries on Bolts, but found nothing. He and his deputies searched the Bolts farmstead for top to bottom, but found no bloody clothes or weapons. Hughes didn't arrest Bolts right away, but demanded the man come to the coroner's inquiry. The coroner's inquiry revealed a surprise. The coroner believed the Stillson-Reids had been killed not just with an axe, but also a knife. He also believed 2 men were responsible for the crime. The coroner wondered how one man could have used 2 weapons, quickly enough to kill a family of 5. Bolts and Afkin were arrested for the murders, but a grand jury was unable to indict them for lack of enough evidence, so they were released. In all, 8 people spent time in jail accused of the murders, but there was not enough evidence to indict any of them. Two separate $1,000 rewards were offered by St. Clair County and Carl's estranged brother for information leading to the capture of those responsible. Private investigators and the curious swarmed the area, looking for information to collect on the reward. In reality, they probably muddied the waters with crazy theories, more than they helped. Despite the attention and the money, which was substantial for the time, the killers were never found. Bolts eventually filed suit against the Stillson-Reid estate to get what he could. He was awarded $400, packed up his family, moved to Nebraska, and changed his name. The rest of the estate went to Carl Stillson-Reid's estranged brother. The people of Saxtown built coffins for the family and buried them there in Saxtown. Years later, a family member paid to have an obelisk erected in a cemetery in Belleville, but when officials came to move the bodies, the locals wouldn't let them be moved. They believed that they had been desecrated enough, and so they remained buried in unmarked graves. The people of Saxtown argued over who did the killings for the next 100 years. Eventually, families started suing each other to try to protect their reputations, having been repeatedly accused of murder. It's said that for years after, detectives would hide under the beds of dying people, hoping to hear a deathbed confession that would finally break the case. Perhaps the most terrifying part of the entire story is that the murderer or murderers were never found. Complicating the effort for modern detectives is the fact that the original case file disappeared in the 1890s. The Stillson-Reid home was finally torn down in 1954, although a barn built by the Stillson-Reid family is still standing today. People who live on the property still claim that they hear ghostly noises at night, sounds like doors opening and closing and a dog barking. And they claim every year on the anniversary of the murder, they hear a knock at the door. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.